During the glory days of the Republic, you can get a basic education at your local academy, and within just a few years develop a lifelong career working for a government agency or one of the large corporations and make enough credits to finance a nice apartment in the core or a homestead in the mid-rim with enough left over for a reasonably priced starship, hyperdrive equipped of course. It was a pretty good deal, but the real reason why they called this period of time the Golden Age of the Republic was the longevity of that position. Like I said, it's a lifelong career opportunity that you could grow into. A lot of people had it back then. And after you retired, you'd have a pension and savings. You could spend your golden years doing whatever you wanted. But here's the thing, that was your dad's reality, or maybe his father's reality. That was back when the Trade Federation and the Techno Union were fighting against monopolies, not creating ones. This was far before the Republic had created the free trade zone and, pretty much given up on the outer rim. Back when the Chancellor of the Republic still had large, ambitious ideas that didn't involve tyranny, and the Senate was still passing legislation and policy and, not shut down because of gridlock and bureaucracy. But of course, you're not your dad, you're not your granddad, you live in a completely different era, and things are different. Talks of secession in the Outer Rim, labor disputes on the Perlemian trade route, and the Jedi withdrawing from their outposts in the Slice, with pirates and bandits flooding into the vacuum. Things are changing rapidly and not for the better. The institutions that we once relied on are crumbling. The galaxy is far less stable, and there is economic decline everywhere you look. A young man like yourself is far more likely to be working in a contractor position for a large firm, working from project to project, or piecing together a few gigs to make a living, or just going fully independent and doing your own thing. Stable long-term careers were kind of a thing of the past in the late Republic period. It just wasn't something you could depend on. So what the hell happened? How did things get so terrible? And why does your life suck so much? When the previous generation just had to show up and they got all sorts of great things like pensions on top of whatever retirement savings program the government has. You also, got to enjoy a company speeder probably at the company's cost. And when you went on business trips, you flew business class. Not economy like an animal. Some people will blame the corporations, others blame the politicians, some will point at the Sith. The truth is, everyone is somewhat involved. This is a complex decline. It might seem obvious, but having 1,000 years of no war, no conflict, does wonders for your economy and society. The Ruusan Reformation's demilitarization happened at the highest level of galactic organization. The Galactic Republic had won its battle against the Sith, and as the sole power in the galaxy, they decided to go the route of peace. They got rid of the federal military and passed their mandate to maintain security to the local level. With massive savings in their budget, something known as the peace dividend started hitting the Republic in full force. The peace dividend is a term that was popularized in our own timeline in the late 80s and 90s when the Cold War ended. Western governments, especially the United States, started cutting defense budgets and redirecting them towards domestic priorities. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, American defense spending dropped from 6% GDP in 1989 to only 3% of GDP by 1999. During this time period, Democrat Bill Clinton, President of the United States, surprisingly balanced the budget and had budget surpluses from 98 to 2001, something that is almost impossible in today's environment, no matter which political party is in charge. The Galactic Republic was also gifted with a huge peace dividend thanks to their policies. After the Ruusan Reformation, the longer the peace lasted, the more optimistic the galaxy became. People trusted the central government. They were engaged in the system. We had a healthy and vibrant representative democracy, and it was policy that was being discussed in the Senate, not just politics. And so the Senate wasn't frozen. It was passing much-needed bills that would reform the government and create more opportunities for the expansion period that would follow. During this time period, leaders like Supreme Chancellor Lina So concentrated far more power in the executive branch and funded multiple infrastructure and cultural projects aimed at increasing the influence of the Republic. This also included creating new hyperspace lanes, surveying new routes, maintaining old ones, and also seeding these hyperspace lanes with communication buoys so that there is better coverage and better comms all across the Republic. There's also the construction of patrol stations for Jedi and Republic judicial forces to maintain security in these sparsely populated areas. These are capital-intensive projects, oftentimes with very little financial return. But the government provides these types of important services to allow other sectors to flourish. Suddenly, people were moving into the mid and outer rim. They were starting new lives, building communities, starting companies. Historically, the Sith had called these areas home and ran a highly centralized autocratic government where resources were controlled by either oligarchs or the state. Now, all of those resources were available for exploitation by the Republic's free market. And so what you had was a booming economy, mainly driven by government investment, which is a great guarantor, and that, of course, attracted business interests to these areas. And these are long-term investments. Without the Sith and Galactic War to worry about, companies could put their full weight and determination behind massive projects that often took decades to complete. Bigger projects meant more long-term thinking, which also meant longer demand for labor for these projects, and that, of course, led to more stable jobs. Corellian Engineering Corporation was a huge winner after the Ruusan Reformation. Thanks to government policy, there is now a huge demand for smaller personal starships that could be used by pioneers and small companies. Han Solo's father actually found work on one of the lines in Cornet City, and at first he was really proud of his job building YT-1300s. And that's because he was building the very ships that would expand the Republic's influence beyond his own local system. Demand for CEC starships meant that there are vendors like Gyrodyne, who produces hyperdrives, also had a new flood of orders, and that benefited their own suppliers like parts supplier Konosair Manufacturing. This economic boom reached all the way to the raw resource mining and processing industries. Iradu, for instance, was a hub for lawmite extraction, the main ingredient in transferrous steel. The boom in starship construction also increased the demand for lawmite, and that, of course, made Iradu exceptionally powerful. Now, the Republic's government wasn't only involved in investing in infrastructure, they were also playing an important part as a counterweight against business and corporate interests. They served as regulators. The Republic's regulatory agencies created better working conditions for labor. For instance, during the High Republic period, only droids were allowed to perform extravehicular repairs. The Jedi Order were also sent to police the Zygerrian slave empire and push their operations further out of the Republic space so that slave labor couldn't compete against normal labor. It wasn't perfect, mind you. Typically regulations, especially poorly created ones, tend to hurt smaller businesses more than larger businesses, which usually have a much larger operational margin, and so they can absorb the costs of regulations, whereas smaller companies are typically screwed. A large shipping company can afford dedicated droid mechanics for exterior repairs and also organic ones to oversee said repairs. A small cargo ship might only have the resources to hire one organic mechanic or one droid mechanic, not both. Their organic mechanic is going to be far more efficient and capable than their droid counterpart, but it will be illegal for that individual to make repairs outside of the ship. And so the small cargo ship captain has to make a decision between efficiency or breaking the law, which of course is not ideal. But the point is, corporations were still kept in check by the central government, or as Lina So would put it, the public and private sectors were partnered in their unified goal of making the galaxy a more connected and prosperous place. And aside from the military-industrial complex, it was working, and most industries were growing rapidly. And lastly, technology was also relatively stable during this period, and so growth was not very disruptive towards labor markets like automation is in our own world. And so people with learned skills stayed relevant for decades, which sounds awesome. I've worked in media communications since I left college in 2011. I've had 6-7 different job titles and careers. I've had 3 businesses. It's insanity. You also had third-party organizations like the Techno Union and Trade Federation, which, again, believe it or not, at one point acted as watchdog groups. And so there was a culture that not only celebrated labor, but also protected them. But then something happened. Han Solo's father went from being a proud worker on the CEC assembly lines to a very broken man and an alcoholic, who in his few moments of sobriety begged that his son wouldn't follow in his footsteps. Don't build a ship, he said, fly it. Something that I've always translated into don't work for someone else, work for yourself. So what happened to Han Solo's father? What made him so bitter? What changed in the galaxy? Well, the well-meaning policies of the High Republic had mostly failed. The great works championed by Lina Soh had not been backed by adequate military support. The Salt Lake Beacon, the crown jewel in the High Republic's infrastructure plans, had been destroyed by the Nile Marauders. Large mass casualty events occurred during the conflict. A large portion of the galaxy was also cut off by hyperspace anomalies, and therefore trust in the state, in government institutions, in the Jedi began to fall as well. As the central government lost power and influence, like rats bailing out of a sinking ship, the Senate was engulfed in political infighting. When there's plenty of wealth and growth lying around, everyone is more than content to enjoy the party together. But when things get tough, when the music stops, well, that's when things get ugly. The Trade Federation board would be massacred. That was caused by the Sith, who do play a role in all of this. But as I've mentioned before in other videos, the galaxy's decline was not caused by the Sith. They basically exacerbated existing problems and used it to their advantage. Anyway, the Trade Federation board was assassinated and replaced by Neimoidians, who started building the largest trade cartel in the galaxy. A similar shift in strategy and goals also affected the Techno Union, which soon became one of the largest industrial manufacturing conglomerates in the galaxy. Thus began the rise of oligarchs and the hyper-concentration of resources in the hands of just a few companies. When you have this type of consolidation, in theory, you can scale up production and research and development and achieve much grander goals, like, building a moon-sized space station. But here's the thing, if you're the only employer in town, well, that becomes very problematic for the other side, the labor. Most companies actually have fluctuating labor needs based on the demand for their products and what current projects they have going on. In an ideal situation, when you're just focused on profits, a company should fire any worker that they aren't immediately using in a project. You want to basically scale up and down your labor as the situation demands. So let's take the construction of the Death Star as an example. Ideally, you want full employment when you're building that first Death Star, but in between the first one and the second one, you have a period of time where there's not much work to be done. During this time period, you're going to want to probably fire a lot of your staff, so you don't have to pay all of those extra wages. You only need to ramp up hiring when you start construction of the second Death Star's outer frame. Contract work also means you probably don't have to pay for any benefits or any pension. This only further decreases your cost. Now, in a competitive industry, you can't really just fire your entire workforce because most of them will go to competing companies, leaving you with a dilemma when you actually need to ramp up production. And so that's how you secure loyalty of experienced and skilled employees. You give them a salary, you give them a retirement plan, and maybe access to a company speeder. Oh, are they a new parent? Well, we have childcare facilities in the building that's free as well. Now, one of the biggest problems that really started affecting legacy companies that were still kind of treating their employees good was the creation of the free trade zone. Originally, this policy was designed to pick up where Lina Soh had failed. The Republic wanted to expand in the Outer Rim, but they didn't really want to pay for it, and so they cut a deal with the many corporate powers in the galaxy. These entities would be allowed to operate in an almost regulation-free zone, and also a tax-free zone as long as they developed infrastructure in these regions and attracted more population. The result was you had dirt cheap labor, which was honestly borderline slavery, or at least indentured servitude in the Outer Rim. The Trade Federation and the Techno Union controlled everything in their Outer Rim colonies: transportation, cost of goods, cost of energy. These Outer Rim companies would produce raw materials and finished products that completely undercut anything that could be bought or sold in the core regions. And soon we began to see the outsourcing of labor and flight of manufacturing industry from the core regions to the Outer Rim. I mean, Coruscant is a beautiful, shining metropolis, but have you ever flown over the works? It's an entire sector of the surface of the planet that's just dead, covered in decaying factories and smokestacks, a result of the free trade zone's chaotic and uncontrollable growth. The growing unrest that starts with events like the Stark Hyperspace War and blockade of Naboo and ended with the Clone Wars only created a more difficult operating environment for businesses. And the sad truth is, when facing those kind of situations, people who have capital, they can really cut their costs immediately by just firing people. Again, labor gets the short end of the stick. And so during the late Republic period, more and more individuals lost their jobs, found themselves patching together gig work in an effort to make a living when one job used to suffice. And when enough people are suffering like this, there's almost a compound effect. The factory workers lose their jobs, and so the workers don't have the money to go to the brothels or eat at the diner, and so suddenly those jobs are at risk as well. Now, some people will keep their head down and continue to grind hard until they can't. Others will resort to crime, and then some will get political. And the corporations, well, they control the narrative. It's the cheap labor in the Outer Rim that stole all of the jobs from hardworking folks in the core. It's not the companies that outsourced those jobs in the first place that are to be blamed. It's the damn refugees and immigrants flooding our streets that are making local governments bankrupt. Not because corporations aren't paying enough taxes. When the Empire rose to power, Palpatine inherited a disaster of an economy from himself. The banking clans had funded both sides of this destructive conflict. It was an extremely stupid idea that was guaranteed to leave one side completely destroyed and unable to pay back the money they borrowed. Palpatine was centralized political power, but he also consolidated the entire industrial power of the Galactic Republic underneath his control. Those private entities that remained operating were forced to be loyal to the Empire and acquiesce to their demands. The Empire was running a massive budget deficit, and so one of the ways Palpatine tried to get out of that hole was to spend his way out. But of course, this was not successful at all, and so the Imperial military eventually started squeezing their vendors and suppliers, and so the suppliers and vendors started squeezing their labor. More hours for less pay, higher quotas with less benefits. The joke is conditions got so bad that it was borderline slavery. Actually, that's not a joke. The Empire started carrying out mass arrests in its own territories and filling prisons with so-called criminals who were basically free labor for Imperial work camps. At the same time, actual slaves and automation were destroying what little work there was left. It's moments like this where the independent captain, the gig worker, the Han Solos of the world would become the dream. The labor markets were trashed, the education system just funneled you into that trashy labor system, and so the only remaining option you have to survive was to become independent. And there's a lot of money to be made for those who are willing to take the risks. Imperial control over trade, and more specifically the sales of weapons, created a very lucrative black market for those products. If you could afford a ship, you could transport all types of goods, making terrific money. But also sleep easy at night. It wasn't just spice and weapons people needed, there were shortages of everything, including food, clothing, and medicine. The Imperial military and intelligence agencies, despite being so large, were also not really good for pursuing individual dissidents or rebellion groups. And so the Empire also started giving out bounties, very well-paying bounties that created an entire economy of ruthless guns for hire. Now, as someone who was self-employed and, done gigs for a long period of time, I could say it's not like for everyone, right? Maybe like 30%, maybe less, can actually thrive in these kind of situations. Most people do need stable and good employment. That is how societies are built. That's how stability is created, especially in our type of free market economy, or the one that the Republic has. Without stable employment, you can't have a strong and healthy middle class. Without a strong, healthy middle class, you're not going to have good politics. You're not going to have stable and moderate voters. We're looking for rational fixes to our many problems. Instead, they'll become victims to populists, to extreme candidates who promise huge, sweeping reforms without actually being able to deliver. And so the rise of the gig economy might be great for a few souls, like Han Solo, but one could argue that people like him will survive and prosper in any type of government system. And so the downside to a society where, working gigs is the dream, is the reality, is that most people become vulnerable. They don't have a safety net. They can't stop working, and they definitely can't start saving for their future. And in a galaxy like that, it's pretty grim for the future, don't you think? Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.